$500. That's the approximate cost of the materials in a fiberglass speedboat rigged with explosives and guided by a basic GPS receiver. It is a crude device. There is nothing sophisticated about it. A competent welder and a motivated engineer can assemble one in a matter of days. Now hold that number in your mind. The Arleigh Burke-class guide and missile destroyer, the workhorse of the United States Navy's surface fleet, costs approximately $2 billion per hull. A single rolling airframe missile, the Close and Defense Interceptor, designed to stop incoming threats, costs around $200,000. A Patriot PAC-3 MSC interceptor, the system the Navy and U.S. Army lean on for missile defense in the Gulf region, runs roughly $4 million per shot. $4 million to stop a $500 boat. That ratio, 8,000 to 1, is the number keeping Pentagon war planners awake at night. It is the number that Lloyd's of London underwriters started quietly pricing into maritime insurance premiums when the IRGC's naval forces began their harassment campaigns in the Gulf. It is the number that Lockheed Martin's production schedulers think about when they calculate the gap between the current demand for interceptors and what the production lines can actually deliver. This isn't a hypothetical scenario from a Rand Corporation white paper. This is the operational reality of the Strait of Hormuz right now, today. And before this video is over, you will understand exactly why that simple arithmetic threatens to reshape the entire strategic balance in the Middle East. What you're about to hear is not a story about weapon systems. It's a story about economics, geography, and the hard limits of military power when those two forces work against you simultaneously. We're going to walk through three interconnected problems that converge in the same narrow waterway. The cost equation, why the United States cannot sustain a war of attrition where the attacker's cheapest weapon outpaces the defender's most expensive response. Israel's strategic positioning, what Benjamin Netanyahu's public statements actually signal about decision-making timelines and what a day after scenario in Iran genuinely means for the region, and the diplomatic dimension, the quiet back channel conversations about a new framework for the Gulf that Washington and Tehran have both publicly denied and privately acknowledged. Understanding all three requires you to first understand the geography, because the geography is the trap. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. That's the distance from Manhattan to roughly the New Jersey shoreline. Not much room to maneuver a ship that is 505 feet long and displaces 9,000 tons. Roughly 21 million barrels of oil pass through that strait every single day. That is approximately 21% of the world's total petroleum liquids. When analysts talk about strategic choke points, they are speaking abstractly. When they talk about the Strait of Hormuz, they mean it concretely. Close that waterway for 30 days, and the global economy enters a supply shock, the likes of which it has not seen since the 1973 Arab oil embargo, but far worse, because the economies dependent on that flow are now larger, more interconnected, and less resilient. Iran understands this completely. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, the IRGCN, is not designed to fight a blue water battle against the U.S. Fifth Fleet. They know they would lose that fight. The IRGCN is designed to make the cost of winning that fight so high, so sustained, and so economically damaging that the United States decides the whole enterprise isn't worth it. That strategy has a formal name in military doctrine, anti-access area denial, or A2AD. The concept is simple. You don't need to defeat your enemy's forces in a traditional engagement. You need to make the operational environment so costly, so dangerous, and so unpredictable that your enemy chooses not to operate there at all. Iran's implementation of A2AD in the Gulf is, by any serious military analysis, genuinely formidable. They have layered it across four distinct threat categories. First, the swarm boats. The IRGCN operates hundreds of small class fiberglass vessels, some crewed, some remotely piloted, some designed as one-way weapons. They are hard to detect on radar because of their low profile and the radar clutter generated by waves. They move at speeds that challenge the reaction time of a ship's close-in weapon systems. And they can be deployed in swarms, meaning you may be able to stop the first three and the fourth one still reaches you. Second, the anti-ship missiles. Iran has developed and deployed a range of shore-based anti-ship missiles, the Noor, the Q, the Core, the Zafar, with ranges sufficient to cover the entire width of the strait and portions of the Gulf of Oman. These are not primitive weapons. The Noor is a domestically produced version of the Chinese C-802, which in 2006 struck an Israeli Navy corvette off the Lebanese coast, nearly sinking it. Iran's current inventory is more capable than what Hezbollah was operating that day. Third, sea mines. Iran has one of the largest mine inventories in the Middle East. During the tanker war of the 1980s, Iranian mines damaged multiple vessels, including the USS Samuel B. Roberts. Incident Ronald Reagan used to justify Operation Praying Mantis, the largest U.S. surface naval engagement since World War II. The mine threat in the strait remains real because mines are cheap, patient, and extraordinarily difficult to clear under fire. Fourth, submarines. Iran operates 3 Russian-built Kilo-class submarines and a larger number of domestically built midget submarines, the Ghadir class. These are not the most advanced submarines in the world, but in the shallow, acoustically cluttered waters of the Persian Gulf, they are a genuine threat that requires constant anti-submarine warfare attention from U.S. forces, attention that consumes time, assets, and money. Put all 4 layers together, and you have a defense in-depth system that was designed specifically to exploit the geographic constraints of the strait and to exhaust the economic patience of the United States. Now we get to the mathematics, and the mathematics are the point. In the summer of 2023, during a period of elevated tensions following the IRGC's seizure of 2 oil tankers, the USS Bataan Amphibious Ready Group conducted extended operations in the Gulf. During one 70-hour period of elevated alert, the group expended an estimated 10 rolling airframe missiles in response to drone threats. 10 missiles, $2 million in interceptors, to stop threats that collectively cost perhaps a few $1,000s to build and launch. Multiply that exchange rate across a sustained conflict, one that lasts not days, but weeks or months, and the arithmetic becomes genuinely. The United States military has a finite inventory of high-end interceptors. Production rates for Patriot PAC. 3 MSE missiles are approximately 550 units per year, according to Lockheed Martin's public production figures. The total U.S. Army stockpile is classified, but independent analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies estimated in 2023 that a high-intensity conflict involving sustained missile exchanges in Ukraine, in the Gulf, and potentially on the Korean Peninsula simultaneously would exhaust certain interceptor categories within weeks, not months. This is not a hypothetical risk. The transfer of Patriot systems to Ukraine has already drawn down US and NATO inventories to levels that have prompted emergency procurement requests to Congress. In the context of a Gulf conflict, what that means practically is this: the US Navy would be fighting a missile defense war where the cost per successful intercept is measured in millions against an adversary whose cost per launch is measured in thousands. That is not a sustainable attrition ratio. The IRGC and war planners understand this. It's not a secret, it's the explicit logic behind Iran's stated strategy of closing the strait as a deterrent measure. The threat is credible not because Iran could defeat the US Navy, they cannot, but because Iran could impose costs on the United States and the global economy that Washington's domestic politics would struggle to absorb. Here is where the analysis deepens. The $500 boat is the opening move in a sequence. The actual goal is not to sink a U.S. destroyer. The actual goal is to force enough interceptor expenditure, enough sustained defensive posture, enough insurance premium escalation on commercial shipping that the economic cost of maintaining the Fifth Fleet's operational presence in the Gulf exceeds the political will of Congress and the White House to sustain it. Lloyd's of London has already started pricing this calculation. War risk premiums for vessels transiting the Gulf spiked by 300% during the 2023 tanker incidents. Container shipping companies rerouted vessels around the Cape of Good Hope, adding 2 weeks to delivery times and significant fuel costs rather than accept the risk and the insurance expense. The economic damage from Iran's threats occurred without Iran firing a single shot at a U.S. naval vessel. That is a strategically effective use of $500 boats. Into this already complicated equation, we now insert Israeli domestic politics and one of the most consequential decisions Benjamin Netanyahu has ever been required to make. Since at least 2010, successive Israeli governments have publicly stated that a nuclear armed represents an existential threat to Israel. That position has not changed. What has changed is the timeline. The International Atomic Energy Agency's February 2024 report indicated that Iran had accumulated sufficient enriched uranium that with further enrichment, the weapons grade, it could potentially produce enough fissile material for multiple warheads within a matter of weeks, not months. That is a threshold that Israeli military planners call the zone of immunity, the point at which Iran's nuclear infrastructure is dispersed, hardened, and buried deeply enough that an Israeli airstrike can no longer plausibly destroy it. Netanyahu's public statements in the months following the October 7th Hamas attack need to be read through that strategic lens. When he speaks about ensuring that Iran never achieves a nuclear weapon, he is not speaking abstractly. He is signaling to Washington, to Tehran, and to his own military establishment that the window for decisive action, if such action is to be taken, is closing. The day after scenario that Israeli and American planners discuss is not primarily about the military strike itself. It is about what happens in the 72 hours following a strike. The assumptions: Hezbollah launches its full rocket and missile arsenal at northern Israel, potentially 3,000 to 4,000 projectiles per day at maximum intensity. Biohamas, degraded but not destroyed, conducts whatever operations it can from Gaza. Iran launches ballistic missile salvos at Israeli territory. as it demonstrated it could do in April when it fired over 300 drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles at Israel in a single night. In that scenario, the United States is not a spectator. U.S. assets in the region, the carrier strike groups, the air bases in Qatar and Bahrain, the command facilities in Kuwait, are all within range of Iranian retaliation. The U.S. would be drawn into the conflict not by a formal decision, but by the geographic reality of where its forces are positioned. This is what Netanyahu's rhetoric actually means when analyzed operationally. He is not simply posturing for his domestic audience, so he is certainly doing that. He is making a public case that the United States has a shared interest in preventing Iranian nuclear capability, and that if Washington will not act, Israel may. The implicit message to Washington is either you lead this or we force you to follow. Whether that gambit is strategically sound is a separate question. The point is that it is a deliberate signal, not a spontaneous outburst, and the Pentagon receives that signal clearly. Parallel to all of this military posturing, there is a second track, quieter, less visible, and in some respects more significant. Since late 2023, Omani intermediaries have facilitated indirect contacts between U.S. and Iranian officials regarding what has been described in regional diplomatic circles as a temporary framework, not a comprehensive nuclear deal, not a JCPOA 2.0, but a more limited arrangement. Iran agrees to cap uranium enrichment, although weapons grade, accept additional IAEA, EIAA, and reduce support to proxy forces in Yemen and Iraq. In exchange, the United States releases a portion of frozen Iranian assets. The figure most commonly cited in background briefings to journalists is somewhere in the range of $10 to $15 billion, and commits to not actively supporting or facilitating an Israeli strike. Neither government has formally acknowledged these contacts. The Biden administration and subsequently the Trump administration and significant demonstration faced significant domestic political constraints in being seen to negotiate with Iran. Iran's own internal politics, the Revolutionary Guard's hostility to any arrangement that limits its operational autonomy, make public acknowledgement that limits its operational autonomy, make public acknowledgement equally difficult for Tehran. But the signals had been visible to anyone reading the pattern carefully. The pace of IRGC harassment operations in the Gulf declined noticeably in the fourth quarter of 2023. The frequency of Houthi attacks on commercial shipping, while still elevated, showed a pattern consistent with calibrated pressure rather than maximum effort. Iran's public messaging shifted from direct threats about closing the strait to more qualified language about protecting its rights and responding to aggression. These are the behavioral fingerprints of a government that is simultaneously maintaining its deterrent posture and leaving space for a diplomatic exit. Whether that space translates into a durable arrangement depends on factors that are genuinely difficult to predict. Netanyahu's domestic political survival depends partly on maintaining a hard line against Iran. The Revolutionary Guard's institutional interests are threatened by any arrangement that limits their freedom of action. And the United States government's attention is, as always, divided among multiple competing priorities. What is clear is that a diplomatic framework exists, that back-channel contacts have occurred, and that both sides have demonstrated in their actions, if not their words, a preference for managed tension over open conflict. Let me bring this back to where we started. The $500 boat is not ultimately a story about military technology. It is a story about the limits what overwhelming conventional superiority can actually achieve in a constrained geographic and political environment. The United States Navy is, without question, the most powerful maritime force in human history. No other nation comes close. And yet, in the narrow waters of the Strait of Hormuz, that power is constrained by geography, by economics, and by the political patience of the American public in ways that a fiberglass speedboat is not. This is the insight that the best strategic analysts, the ones who have actually sat across a table from adversaries, who have read intelligence assessments rather than press releases, understand intuitively. Military power is not an absolute. It is a relative calculation measured against a specific adversary in a specific geography over a specific time frame. When those three factors are unfavorable, even the most capable military in the world can find itself in a position where winning the battle costs more than the battle is worth. Iran's strategic planners are not naive. They have watched what happened to Iraq. They have watched what happened to Libya. They have drawn the conclusion that the one thing that prevented regime change in both cases was the absence of a credible deterrent. They have decided that their deterrent will be asymmetric, not a conventional military match for the United States, but a cost imposition strategy sophisticated enough to make the cost of confrontation exceed the benefit. Whether or not you find Iranian foreign policy sympathetic, and there are many good reasons not to, that strategic logic is coherent. It is, in fact, the same logic that drove the United States to develop its own asymmetric capabilities during the Cold War. The question for American strategic planners is not how to defeat Iran's $500 boats. They can do that. The question is whether defeating them at the cost of thousands of $4 million interceptors and the risk of a wider regional war serves U.S. national interests better than a negotiated arrangement that caps Iranian nuclear capability, reduces proxy warfare, and keeps the strait open for the 21% of global oil that transits it every day. That is not a military question. It is a political one. And in Washington, political questions have a way of being answered by whoever controls the budget and the news cycle, not necessarily by whoever controls the budget and the news cycle. The $500 boat will still be waiting in the water when that answer comes. If this analysis gave you a clearer picture of what's actually happening in the Gulf, consider subscribing to FlashPoint. We publish this kind of breakdown every week, the real numbers behind the headlines without the theater. And I want to ask you one specific question in the comments. Do you think the United States has the political will to sustain a long-term defensive posture in the Strait of Hormuz? If economic cost keeps rising, leave your analysis below. I read every comment. This channel is not affiliated with Ray McGovern or any of his official representatives. The content you just watched is informational in nature, inspired by the publicly available teachings, writings, and interviews of Ray McGovern. It does not constitute professional advice of any kind, not military, not financial, not political. The analysis presented is based on open source intelligence, publicly available economic data, and strategic reports. Before making any major decision in this area, please do your own research and consult a qualified professional. All footage and images used in the video version of this content belong to their respective owners and are referenced under fair use for commentary and educational purposes only.